Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Welcome to today's seminar, today's lunchtime event hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. Today's seminar has the title Thomas Spence and Common Property, a Political Plan Against Poverty and Empire. And will be based on the recently published The Political Thought of Thomas Spence Beyond Poverty and Empire. Our presenter today is Dr. Matilde Cazzola, author of that work and a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory in Frankfurt, Germany. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Cazzola here speaking with us today, all the more so since I know it is quite early over there in Frankfurt. Thanks especially to her for getting up early in order to share her truly fascinating research with us. Fascinating both due to, casting greater light on the really important thought of Thomas Spence, and also due to the connections that she explores between his work and the evolution of the British Empire in the early 19th century, really important and interesting themes. So those of you who have attended these seminars before will know how it usually goes. Dr. Cazzola will speak for around 45 minutes. After that, we will have a chance to open the floor for questions and discussion. If you have any questions, send them to me via Zoom. In fact, if you want me to read them out, I will read them out. If you would like for me to unmute you so you can pose the question yourself, I am very happy to do that too. So if you just want to put yourself on the queue, let me know that as well. It's always the case with Zoom presentations that the questions are a little slow coming in. So if you want to make sure you get your question in, you get your place on the queue to ask a question, then make sure to send me a chat message early, and I'll be sure to pass you the floor. For everyone's information, the event will be recorded and posted on the center's website shortly following today's talk, so you can share it with colleagues or watch it again if you want to there. And without further ado, that concludes my opening remarks. Let me hand over the floor to Dr. Cazzola.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to present my book here today within the Transnational Legal History Group seminar. And I want to express my heartfelt thanks to Professor Christopher Roberts for inviting me to do so, and to all of you who are attending the seminar. So I should anticipate that the book, is not strictly speaking a legal history book, is more at the intersection of intellectual history and social history. I will try now to share my PowerPoint presentation. You'll see. Yeah, I'm not an artist. Okay, so I think you should see it. Okay. So, okay. In fact, the book recounts the thought of the English radical thinker Thomas Spence, who lived between 1750 and 1814, and whose writings epitomized the struggles against land privatization and nascent industrialization in Britain. Spence is renowned for his political plan, so-called plan, which I'm now going to sketch very briefly. Spence's plan was a proposal for the abolition of private land ownership and the return to the common enjoyment of the land. The state apparatus would be dismantled and replaced with a decentralized parish system. The parish administration would petition and redistribute the plots of land to individuals and families, and everyone would pay rent for using and tilling the soil. And this rent would be paid in place of all other taxes and duties formally collected and would be used by the parishes for many purposes, including the funding of local social services, from hospitals to schools. Spence also anticipated that part of the total amount of the rents would be left over And these remainders would constitute what he called the dividends, namely shares of money to be redistributed according to a quarterly schedule among all parishioners. As to the method by which the plan might be implemented, at least since the mid-1790s, being inspired by the French Revolution, and especially the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution, Spence started advocating the revolution of the Swedish multitudes. So this phrase, Swedish multitude, was coined by Edmund Burke, Thomas Spence's famous contemporary, in his reflections on the revolution in France, to refer with contempt to the poor proletariat whose distress and insubordination was jeopardizing the security of the property establishment, both in France and across the Channel. And Spence, in turn, took the phrase Swedish multitude and used it to refer with pride to his own political interlocutor and preferred political actor. So, Thomas Spence has long been considered an eccentric and anachronistic figure, as his calls for the common property of the land in a Britain then undergoing industrialization allegedly confined his plan and his thought to the past. British labor historian E.P. Thompson, in his masterpiece, The Making of the English Working Class, defined Spence as the inventor of peripheral panaceas to social evils, which made him sound like, in Thompson's own words, a little more than a crank. And in fact, Spence lived in the age when capital was detaching itself from the land, becoming commercial and financial, and when the capitalist command over the laborers was no longer founded on immovable landed possessions only, but was increasingly acquiring the movable form of money and wages. And it is therefore understandable that Spence's thoughts seemed peripheral to a historian like E.P. Thompson, who was interested in the growth of the British industrial working class at the beginning of the first industrial revolution. However, I still think that if contextualized within the transitional years of British history in which Spence lived, when subsisting early modern institutions still coexisted with novel production processes, Spence's plan, I think, can be interpreted as a direct response to the social dislocation resulting from land enclosures and the dismantling of the poor relief that accompanied the establishment of the market economy in Britain between the 18th and the 19th centuries. In recent years, a small group of scholars have turned their attention to Spence, rediscovering him and his work within the fields of radical history, labor history, and also Atlantic history. So my book is a contribution to this ongoing exploration of Thomas Spence by means of a historical and intellectual analysis of Spence as a political thinker. So the book is aimed to demonstrate that having the penniless and often illiterate members of the so-called Swedish multitude as his privileged political interlocutors, the complexity of Spence's thought has been obscured by the simplicity of the language he used to convey his plan, and also the eccentric means he employed to disseminate it. The current oblivion still surrounding Thomas Spence, Spence's name and his exclusion from the realm of the history of political thought is quite at odds with the renown of his plan in late 18th and early 19th century Britain. So just to provide you with very few biographical details about Spence. So Spence was born in 1750 to poor Scottish parents in Newcastle upon Tyne, where he worked as a school teacher for years. And in 1771, Newcastle commoners provided Spence with evidence of the effectiveness of organized opposition to privatization, as they demonstrated against the attempts to enclose the parts of the commons, the Newcastle commons, known as Town Moor, which is still there, by the way, And their successful resistance led to the Newcastle Town Moor Act of 1774, which limited the leasing of land on the town moor and made it conditional upon the commoners' approval. And significantly, 1 year later, 1775, Spence first presented his plan for the abolition of private land ownership before the Newcastle Philosophical Society, which immediately expelled him. His increasing intellectual isolation and dismal economic conditions led him to move to London. We don't know the date exactly, between the late 1780s and the early 1790s. And in London, he became soon acquainted with the working class and Republican association, London Corresponding Society, which was the leading group of the London working class by that time, and had been established in 1792. But Spence's radical social views did not wholly coincide with the reformist approach of his fellow associates in the LCS, as the LCS members were mainly committed to campaigning for parliamentary reform. In London, Spence opened a bookstall in Chancery Lane, where he started selling radical pamphlets and broadsides. And after a while, he transferred its trade to a bookshop in Holborn, which he renamed as another part of London, which he renamed the Hive of Liberty. And it was especially at his bookshop that Spence's activities as a publicist grew particularly eclectic. He made use of every available means to convey and popularize his plan, not just pamphlets, songs, ballads, and broadsides, but also chalk graffiti, tokens, and medallions, able to spread by means of mottos and images, radical political principles. So this is just a very small selection. You see that some of the coins, some of Spence's coins were had mottos over engraved over already circulating coins, like the one "No landlords, you fools, Spences Plan Forever." Others were of his own minting. You see one with 3 men dancing around the pole with the head of Prime Minister William Pitt on it, or another one with a guillotine. So by throwing his coins out of the windows of his bookshop and into the street, Spence became extremely popular in the radical London underground of the 1790s. Another remarkable example of Spence's popular propaganda was the publication between 1793 and 1795 of his periodical Pigsmeet, or Lessons for the Swedish Multitude, which is a collection of extracts from classic political texts reprinted in affordable weekly penny numbers for the Swedish Multitude. And Pigsmeet was indeed a publishing success, with 1,500 copies printed per week. So Spence's activities as a radical propagandist is selling of banned treaties by other authors and the writing and publishing of his own seditious pamphlets advocating the revolution of the Swedish multitude and the abolition of private land ownership were not something that British state authorities were willing to tolerate. And indeed, the intolerance of state authorities provides reliable evidence for the widespread dissemination of Spence's plan. And also demonstrates, I think, that advocates of the established order consider him a serious political thinker and organizer. When in 1792, the conservative judge and paymaster to the Metropolitan Police, John Reeves, founded the Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levellers, which was a sort of governmental group, governmental intelligence group that organized anti-Jacobin demonstrations and prosecuted forbidden writings. So Spence's bookstall became one of Reeves Association's targets. And meanwhile, social distress was spreading across Britain, as the war with France, declared in 1793, brought about a decline in trade and a dramatic increase in unemployment, as well as, of course, the threat of the circulation of the French revolutionary ideology across the Channel. Therefore, the organization of anti-radical groups such as John Reeves went hand in hand with new laws against seditious practices and writings. While 2 parliamentary committees were appointed to investigate popular disaffection, habeas corpus was suspended in 1794. The so-called 2 acts, the Seditious Meetings Act and the Treasonable Practices Act, were passed in 1795. And Spence was among the victims of state repression. However, despite the political, physical, and commercial intimidation he experienced, he stubbornly carried on his activities as a writer and a bookseller. In 1792, Spence was detained at Clerkenwell prison for a short period for seditious libel. In January 1793, he was arrested by the Bow Street Runners. The Bow Street Runners were the police force affiliated with Reeves Association. And he was arrested for selling the second part of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. The Thomas Paine's work had been outlawed by a royal proclamation in December 1792, leading to a flurry of prosecutions against booksellers connected with Paine, included Spence. In May 1794, Spence was arrested under the charge of high treason together with other members of the London Corresponding Society. However, while his fellow associates were soon acquitted and released, Spence was jailed in Newgate without trial for 7 months. In 1798, the year of the Great Irish Rebellion, Spence was arrested again for his alleged connections with the Society of United Irishmen, the revolutionary organization that sought to establish an independent Irish Republic. And he was detained for a short period at the House of Correction at Coldbath Fields. Then in 1801, Spence was once again arrested and convicted by the Court of King's Bench for the publication of his lengthiest writing, The Restore of Society to its Natural State, in which the violent and revolutionary methods of his plan were especially emphasized. So according to official documents, Spence's labor was a malicious, seditious, and ill-disposed person and greatly disaffected to our said Lord the King and to the government and constitution of Israel, and maliciously and seditiously devising and intending to excite a spirit of discontent and disaffection in the minds of the liege subjects of our said Lord the King, and to cause the same subjects to think and believe that the ownership and enjoyment of land by the present owners and proprietors are the causes of great evil and oppression to the people, and to move and persuade the same subjects to overturn and destroy the rights of property in land as now by law established. So being unable to afford an attorney, Spence led his own defense in court, stressing the fact that he was, as he said, tried by men of property concerning a work the sole object of which is to modify property. However, Spence seized the opportunity of the trial to read out loud the complete version of the writing for which he had been arrested, and in so doing, a copy of the Restore of Society to its Natural State survived also in the official documents of the court. Indeed, it took a good dose of audacity to read out loud a book calling for the complete overthrow of the proprietary establishment of the kingdom at the court of King's Bench in times of strict censorship and savage repression. And it was with a mixture of perplexity and admiration that pamphleteer and Member of Parliament William Cobbett, who had attended the trial, later remarked that, I quote, "When Spence was brought up for trial, I was present in the court of King's Bench. He did not seem at all afraid of any punishment and appeared much more anxious about the success of his plan than about the preservation of his life." And the verdict by which Spence was sentenced to a year's imprisonment and a fine convicted him for devising a plan of equalization to be promoted by a system of rapine and murder. And Spence was then imprisoned for 1 year at Shrewsbury Prison. And while some journalists deemed his conviction excessively harsh, the authorities were aware that Thomas Spence and his plan did represent a threat to the established order. So in 1801, Parliament issued the second report of the Committee of Secrecy and Treasonable Practices, which you see here, which stressed the danger represented by the society called Stensonians, whose members, according to the report, stirred up the lower orders of society by the prospect of the partition of the landed property of the country, as well as by treasonable toasts such as the guillotine, a cure for the king evil. So as one member of parliament observed during the debates over this report in the House of Commons, the Stensonians, he said, recommended the complete extermination of royalty, nobility, and property for the purpose of an equal parochial division of the profits of lands and the establishment of a beautiful and powerful new republic. And this would be accomplished by a general, I'm still quoting from the House of Commons debate, a general insurrection of the people for which the revolutionary outrages in France are held as laudable examples. So nonetheless, at the beginning of the 19th century, the authorities were unable to find evidence of the existence of this Spensonian society. Attended with a numerous shrine of political admirers. So appropriate medallions were distributed and a pair of scales preceded his corpse, indicative of the justice of his use. So even Spences Farewell became an occasion for political propaganda. So 1 year after Spence's death, the seemingly interminable war with France ended, and masses of disbanded soldiers and sailors returned home unemployed. And while several Whig reformers continued petitioning for parliamentary reform, Spence's thought fueled what historian Hippie Thompson called the illegal tradition, which survived in London streets and pubs through to the mid-19th century. So in 1814, this illegal tradition came to be organized more formally into the Society of Spence and Philanthropists. The society was founded by artisan Thomas Evans, and it became the leading group within London insurrectionary politics. The Spencers became, in fact, the indefatigable orators and agitators of the radical London underground through the 1810s. And they chalked subversive messages on the walls throughout the city, as William Cobbett again reported in his weekly political register in 1816 that, I quote, "We have all seen for years past written on the walls in and near London these words, Spence's plan." It is difficult to estimate the membership of the Spences Society. What is less debated is the fact that the society gathered followers from the lowest social orders, poor artisans and laborers supporting Jacobinism, religious enthusiasts, and also immigrants of African descent from the Americas. And the years following 1815, with the demobilization of the army and the navy at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, witnessed an escalation of popular protests. And the reaction of the British government followed an established path, as the printing of reactionary and conservative periodicals intensified, and habeas corpus was repeatedly suspended. And according to some scholars, while in the 1790s, the suspension of habeas corpus had been justified by war with France, in 1817, one of the main reasons was, in fact, the increasingly alarming radicalization of Spenceanism. So in order to precipitate a general insurrection, the Spencers organized mass meetings in Staffield, London, in November and December 1816 and February 1817. And these demonstrations had diverse explicit purposes, from the extension of the suffrage to the suppression of machines in factories. But the secret plan of the Spencers was to inflame the mob, lead protesters to an assault on the Tower of London and the Bank of England, and lead them to establish a provisional government, which would cancel the national debt and abolish private land ownership. So despite these organizational efforts, the three riots met with failure. And meanwhile, as they reenacted the legislation of the 1790s, the state authorities also renewed their Seditious Meetings Act. And during the parliamentary debates around the bill in March 1817, while a member of parliament for Newcastle proposed to divide the new law, the new Seditious Meetings Act, into two parts, and as he said, a temporary one for the prevention of seditious meetings and a permanent one as far as the Spences principles are concerned, another member of parliament warned his colleagues at the House of Commons that, I quote, "Those gentlemen deceive themselves who believe the doctrines of the Spences to be wholly speculative. They entertain the hope of reducing their absurd theory to practice, and they aim at nothing less than the confiscation of the property of the country." So once passed, the Seditious Meetings Act 1817 banned, I quote, "all societies professing for," so you see it in here, the Act banned all societies professing for the object the confiscation and division of the land, particularly certain societies or clubs calling themselves Spences or Spences philanthropists. And with this act, Spenceism became, in fact, the only political ideology to have ever been explicitly outlawed by the British Parliament. So I will go back to, we'll come back to this slide later. So likewise, the report of the Committee of Secrecy of Lords and Commons published in that same year, 1817, stressed that attempts have been made in various parts of the country, as well as in the metropolis, to take advantage of the distress in which the laboring and manufacturing classes of the community are at present involved, to induce them to look for immediate relief, not only in a reform of parliament, but in a total overthrow of the existing establishments. This hope and prospect of spoliation have been actively and industriously propagated by several societies, distinguished by the name of Spences. The doctrines above mentioned have been systematically and industriously disseminated amongst mechanics and manufacturers, discharged soldiers and sailors and laborers of all descriptions. And they have been circulated with incredible activity and perseverance in cheap and often gratuitous publications. It appears that the confidence of the disaffected is such that they represent the numbers involved as amounting to several 100,000, and that their societies are daily increasing. So these lengthy quotations suggest that even if the Spences could not boast of any concrete political achievements, their intellectual influence over the British radical underclass was far-reaching and strong. And the Spences were, in fact, dangerous revolutionaries, and as their politics, if fulfilled, would indeed produce a total rupture with the established order. And the repeated failures of their attempted insurrections between 1816 and 1817 exacerbated the violent attitude of the group, as they started considering murder as a political strategy. So I just go back to this very shortly. So it was especially the Peterloo massacre of 1819, when working class protesters were attacked and killed by the yeomanry during a peaceful demonstration for the extension of the suffrage in Manchester, that represented a turning point, as it was widely interpreted as further evidence of the inefficacy of non-violent action. And in fact, the British government set a trap for the Spences by publicizing a ministerial dinner in Cato Street, London on the 23rd of February, 1820. And the Spences planned the assassination of the Prime Minister and the cabinet, but their plot having been foiled by a spy. So the leaders were discovered and arrested, and some of their numbers were publicly executed on May Day, 1820, while others were transported to New South Wales. And the failure of the Cato Street conspiracy and the execution and transportation of its leaders were undoubtedly bitter blows to Spenceism as an organized movement. However, they did not condemn neither the Spences nor the ideas of Thomas Spence to oblivion, as the influence of the plan survived well beyond 1820, despite sometimes appearing under new guises. I don't have enough time to dwell on this now, but I just would like to mention that Spence's plan was partly recovered by social reformer Robert Owen to devise his Comparative movement, and it was also assumed as a lodestar by the Chartist movement to outline their own Chartist land plan in the 1840s. So after having talked about the renown and especially the notoriety of Spence and the Spences and about their criminalization and their repeated encounters with the law in early 19th century Britain, I would now like to briefly expose 2 chapters of the book, which deal more specifically with the issues addressed in its subtitle. So the plan was aimed to overcome property on the one hand and colonialism on the other. So the end of poverty was a key feature of Spence's plan to be accomplished through the re-establishment of the common property of land. And I think that Spence's modern and original conception of common property deserves a few words. According to him, commonality as a proprietary regime was incompatible with both private property and public property, which Spence understood not as mutually exclusive, but rather as complementary proprietary systems. And the opposition between commonality and private property depended on Spence's critique of private property as an institution founded upon robbery and the illegitimate expulsion of others from unequal enjoyment, while the commons were considered by him as intrinsically anti-individualistic and at odds with any kind of possession involving forms of exclusion. But Spence's critique of private property ran parallel to his critique of public property. And in fact, he formulated his views on commonality in the second half of the 18th century, when enclosures of land in Britain started being carried out by the state. With the Enclosure Act of 1773, enclosures of land, which were formerly accomplished by means of informal agreements, were made an official act of the British Parliament. However, the emerging critique of capitalism those years soon was about to take the form, paradoxically enough, of a proto-socialist apology for nationalization processes. And instead, so Spence, I think, cannot be seen as a forerunner of socialism, so understood, because for Spence, the central power of the state was no less responsible for continuous assaults against the commons than the landlords, so the private proprietors, whose illegitimate claims were not only justified, but also actively supported by the public authorities. For the state helped landlords to enforce their dominion over the poor by means of a merciless penal system, whereas private land ownership itself could claim legitimacy only if validated by state laws. Spence wrote, in fact, I quote, that the property is the nation, which is saying that property is the public and the public is property, and all things are ordered accordingly, for the laws are made by property and for property. Spence also adopted a broad understanding of the concept of common property as applicable to both nature and society. First of all, he understood the very notion of commons very broadly. For him, the commons were uncultivated forests and pastures, but also cultivated fields, thereby including the ensemble of natural resources together with the products of agricultural labor. Moreover, to him, the commons or the land represented not only the soil in its natural and agrarian sense, but also what he called the means of industry, the platform for new forms of production. And Spence clarified that, I quote, I mean the land with all its appurtenances as structures, buildings, and fixtures, shipping, collieries, mines, and many other great concerns. Interestingly enough, Spence included collieries and mines, which were the proto-industrial systems of production, which he, being a native of the region of Newcastle upon Tyne, was well acquainted with in his definition of the commons of land. And in the years, over the years that followed, some Spencers developed this conception by explicitly applying Spence's notion of common property to the means of industrial production. Therefore, Spence's theorization of the commons was relevant in the light of the transition to the industrial age. As he saw private land ownership as the foundation of the capitalist control in the manufacturing and proto-industrial systems of his years, Spence turned to the land as a resource by means of which wage laborers might hope to reverse the process initiated with land enclosures. And so in this way, I think that Spence's plan reflected the agrarian origins of industrial capitalism. But Spence applied his notion of commonality, not just to nature and the material sides of subsistence and production, but also to society. So labor in society was understood by Spence as the site of production of a wealth which should be commonly appropriated and enjoyed. And the landlords had, in fact, for him, not only, as he said, deprived the commoners of nature's gifts, so by expelling them from fields, but they also had, in his own words, deprived them of their labors for nothing, despoiling them of the product of their work. So the reappropriation of the fruits of labor alongside the fruits of nature would be accomplished by means of the redistribution of what Spence called the dividends. So as already mentioned, under the plan, the inhabitants of parishes would pay a rent to the parish administration in return for the right not to possess the land. So the land was not redistributed as small land holdings, but the rent would be paid in return for the right to till a plot of land, to cultivate it. So after covering all administrative expenses as well as social services, the remaining rent, which Spence expected to amount to 2/3 of the total tax revenue, would constitute what he called the dividends, to be redistributed quarterly, as he said, among all the living souls in the parish, whether male or female, married or single, legitimate or illegitimate, from a day old to the extremest age. And this idea was probably inspired by the Gilbert Act of 1782, which encouraged wage supplementation for poor workers, but also by the system of wage subsidies introduced by the Berkshire parish of Spinham Land in 1795, which guaranteed poor workers a minimum income dependent on the price of bread. But Spence's proposal of dividends was groundbreaking if compared to other to existing systems. So Spence's dividends can indeed be interpreted as an early version of the proposal for an unconditional basic income that social movements as well as several economists are calling for today. And in its most radical version, the unconditional basic income is understood as a universal and perpetual income, irrespective of age, gender, employment, civil status, criminal record, and even citizenship. And Spence's dividends were in fact the forefather of this current proposal, as they would be independent not only of gender, sex, age, civil status, but also of criminal convictions and national origins, as everyone would become a citizen entitled to parochial shares after only 12 months of residence in one of the Spencean parishes. And Spence also wrote that, I quote, "The proprietary right as a human being to a share of the revenue of his district can never be annulled, but by death or banishment." So before saying a few words on how the redistribution of dividends impacted on poverty, I just wanted to remark that the notion of commonality pervaded every aspect of Spence's thought, affecting even knowledge. Spence was also devised phonetic alphabets, which would accomplish a revolution in the English language. But maybe more interestingly, Spence thought that as no individual could generate new ideas without relying on a common intellectual stock and availing themselves of communication and confrontation with others, he also thought that inventions were a common good, and he opposed patents, considering them as an instrument of the privatization of knowledge. He wrote, in fact, that under the plan, if any man publish an invention or secret in medicine or other science or art of importance to mankind, the state does not first tax the possessor by selling him a patent, but then loads his manufacturers with stamps and duties. Now the parliament is obliged to purchase the secret and publish it, thus no quacks or impostors under pretense of secret, are suffered to impose on mankind to rule their elves or pick their pockets, end quote. So the redistribution of dividends, along with the re-establishment of the common property of land, would accomplish the eradication of poverty. So Spence, of course, was not isolated. He expressed his views on poverty within the wide-ranging and heated debate regarding the poor laws raging in Britain between the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. As you might know, in those years, social reformers and political economists alike began to direct harsh criticisms at the traditional system of social aid regulated by the Elizabethan poor law. Reformers believed instead that the poor should no longer be relieved, but usually integrated into the new dynamics of production. According to them, according to the critics of the poor laws, the new labor market, which was necessary for the birth of industrial society in Britain, was contingent on the abolition of traditional poor relief. As a participant in these debates, most famously Jeremy Bentham distinguished poverty from indigence. So the poor were considered, were understood of by Bentham as all those who had to work in order to live. And as such, the poor were indispensable to society because poverty from this perspective was the only sure source of labor. The indigent, instead, were considered to be all those who were unfit to work altogether or unable to survive on their meager provisions. And thereby they represented a threat to social order, as their helpless misery could push them to mount an assault on private property. And so that, according to Bentham, the indigent or paupers should be coerced into working in industry houses. So against Bentham and the other critics of the poor laws who adopted the difference between poverty and indigence, Spence repudiated any distinction between them. His own definition of poverty subsumed both the indigent and people with disabilities, as he said, the widow and the fatherless, the infant and the hoary-head, the blind and the lame, the dumb and all those who have no helpers, as well as all those who did earn wages. So they were not indigent but poor, but they were forced, as he said, they were forced to work 16 hours a day merely not to starve, such as urban artisans, laborers of the manufacturing system, and little tradesmen. And the inclusivity of the group of the Spencer poor is illustrated by his broadside, The Contrast, of 1795, where the poor were depicted as all those who paid taxes they could barely afford, who lived in miserable hovels in want of coals, food, and clothing, who were transported or sent to Bridewell prison for the slightest irregularities, who were pressed and crimped and forced to fight in war, and most importantly, who did all the work, as he wrote. But the poor were also those who were excluded from parliamentary representation and misrepresented, as he wrote in The Contrast, in official politics. Spence's plan was aimed to put an end to all this, as thanks to the perpetual and unconditional redistribution of dividends, he said that there would be no poor, none but would be well clothed, lodged, and fed, so that the poor would also, as paupers, become extinct. So for Spence, rather than providing mere poor relief, the parishes would be responsible for furnishing everyone a respectable and decent standard of living, and would thus, in the end, extinguish poverty. In fact, being provided with money on a regular basis, on a quarterly schedule, by the parish administration, everyone would be enabled, as he wrote, to supply their wants without parochial relief or the degrading pittance of cheerless charity. And the parochial shares, the dividends, would ensure a starting point for the young and ease the declining years of the elderly. They would free women from the obligation to marry purely for economic reasons, They would allow every parishioner to change their residence and immigrate if they wish to do so, enable laborers to, as Spence wrote, turn to what calling they like without compulsion. So the dividends would therefore eliminate not just indigence, but also poverty in its broadest social sense, understood as social dependence and vulnerability. But the dividends were meant to accomplish also something more, as granting everyone enough to live on would also remove the necessity of working in order to live, thereby eradicating the coercion of labor altogether. So thanks to the redistribution of parochial shares, no one, Spence said, would have to drudge continually for permission to live on the earth. And indeed, after the extinction of the unproductive class of landlords, the plan would allow for the possibility of freely deciding how long to work. And while subsistence would be ensured to everyone by the sharing of dividends, each parishioner would be responsible for their extra earnings. Spence wrote, I quote, "Where would be the great harm if some man should but perform half their ordinary work, if they be content with half wages or half gains? He would only make employment for more hands. There would be enough of work done, though men should not be always toiling like slaves," end quote. So in this way, the dividends, by no longer making work a necessary condition for living and subsisting, would abolish the coercion of work itself. And Spence, in fact, also insisted on the importance of rest by stressing the necessary limits of labor. He thought, in fact, that in the existing labor system, the poor were dispossessed not only of their wealth, of the wealth they produce, of the products of their labor, but also of their time. And he wrote that when the people begin to talk of keeping holiday, does our taskmasters take charge to manage matters so that we should be closely employed, and instead of working only 6 days a week, we are obliged to work at a rate of 8 or 9, and yet can hardly subsist, end quote. So Spence was here referring not only to the landlords, but also to the revolutionaries and social reformers of his own years, who were advancing new solutions that echoed the old rhetoric of the value of hard labor. Not just the British critics of the poor laws, such as Jeremy Bentham, but also the French Jacobins. In fact, in their French Republican calendar of 1793, the French Jacobins had extended the traditional weeks into so-called décades, so weeks of 10 days instead of 7, with 8.5 days of labor and only 1.5 days of rest. In one of the constitutions that he drafted for his planned Commonwealth, the Constitution of Spensonia, which was indeed written after the Jacobin abandoned Constitutional Act of 1793, Spence added a clause on the Sabbath or day of rest, in which he proclaimed that to promote cleanliness and refresh the spirit of man and laboring animals, the weeks in Spensonia are but 5 days each, every 5th day being a Sabbath or a day or Sabbath of rest. Thus will be the 4th day of the week be always a market day and a payday for laborers. So yeah, in the slide I put just the image of the section of the French Republican calendar with the decade thing, and that the extract from Spence's Constitution. So unsurprisingly, Spence's repudiation of the commitment to unceasing work was worrying, of course, to the advocates of the established order. An anonymous conservative writer described the week of the Spences Commonwealth as a continuation of Sun Monday. Sun Monday was the name given to the British tradition of absenteeism from work on Mondays. So at this point, I should briefly talk about the other main argument of the book, namely that Spence's plan had a transatlantic scope and was aimed at the abolition of slavery and the decolonization of the world. So Spence made it clear that he considered also the native indigenous peoples and the enslaved people of African origins as part of his revolutionary Zwinish multitude. He opened one of his writings by saying, I beg to be understood as laying down a system of government for the freeborn and shackled minds of the North American and African savages, when in his considerations of savagery, alleged savagery, Spence was still entangled in Eurocentric hierarchies, who have not yet learned to look upon blood-sucking landlords and state leeches with that timorous, superstitious, and cringing reverence paid to such miscreants in a country so well bred as this. So here, Spence may well have had in mind the recurring and increasingly violent revolts which were unsettling, slave revolts which were unsettling the British Caribbean in those years. Meanwhile, the newborn United States was being consolidated as a white regime of property owners. The American Revolution had not questioned the existence of plantation slavery, and Native Americans were suffering repeating attacks on their lands. And in the reign of felicity being a plan for civilizing the Indians of North America, one of these writings of 1796, Spence responded critically to George Washington's 8th State of the Union address. And in this speech, delivered in early December 1796, President Washington had rebuked the Creek Nation for refusing to sell their lands to the government of the United States, even though by virtue of such a sale, the natives would, or so Washington said, be drawn nearer to the civilized states. And Spence was very critical of the rhetoric of the civilizing mission. He sarcastically remarked that, I quote, "This was the good old way practiced by all civilizers of mankind. When any of those intended to civilize a portion of the earth, they entered it with force and arms, took possession of the land, and garrisoned themselves all over the country, and thus reducing the inhabitants on their respective manors to vassals and tenants. Universal submission was the inevitable consequence, a very uncivil way of civilizing the world indeed." End quote. So to Spence, the dispossession of indigenous peoples and plantation slavery were the foreign versions of the enclosures and the imposition of wage labor on former commoners that afflicted England. He saw, therefore, landlordism at home and colonialism abroad as two complementary phenomena, being both aimed at privatizing the land. Indeed, Spence's own Constitution of Spensonia featured a section headed of colonization, which, however, stated that the Commonwealth of Spensonia should establish colonies for the sole purpose of disclaiming all financial benefits from foreign provinces, dominions, and colonies, and declaring all the colonies independent states. So this section of Spence's Constitution, depicting a peaceful process of colonization followed by the Declaration of Independent States, adumbrated the fact that what Spence had in mind was in reality a decolonizing process, a proper war of independence against European empires. So just to provide you with an example, in 1803, he wrote, so these are verses from one of his songs, and he wrote, "Ando my books in queer lingo, I will it send to San Domingo, to the Republic of the Incas for an example how to frame laws. And who knows but if God may please, it should come by the West Indies." So at the beginning of the 19th century, the Viceroyalty of Peru was still under Spanish control, but several upheavals made Spence hope for the restoration of an independent Republic of the Incas. But even more remarkable was Spence's mention of Saint-Domingue, where the slaves were by that time succeeding in defeating the French. Spence might have also known that for a short period in that year, 1803, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, had adopted the name Army of the Incas for his troops in solidarity with other anti-colonial uprisings. And after the short-lived Constitution of Saint-Domingue of 1801, in 1803, the island, Haiti, was still lacking a constitution. and Spence proposed to send his own plan as an example how to frame laws. This is the only explicit mention of Saint-Domingue, shortly to be renamed Haiti, to be found in Spence's writings. But this quotation suggests that the feat of the Haitian slaves must have had an impact upon Spence's thought. And moreover, it demonstrates that Spence also considered the British West Indies as a favorable location for the establishment of his plan. The transnational scope of the plan was indeed the reason the Spences Society was able to attract disciples from colonial context. Among the Spences, there were two Jamaicans, William Davidson and Robert Wedderburn. And Spence would indeed seem to have been better known in the British West Indies than had been previously thought. From Jamaican Spence's Robert Wedderburn's own correspondence, we know that in 1817, one Miss Elizabeth Campbell, a Jamaican plantation owner, emancipated her slaves and redistributed the land to them as freemen in the name of Spence's plan. In one of her letters to Wedderburn, Miss Campbell recounted how the Jamaican authorities had reacted to her act of emancipation. And she writes, "By setting my slaves free and giving them the land agreeable to Spence's plan, it has cast me into a gulf of trouble." So she said that while a clerk refused to record her intentions in the official documents of the island, the governor of Jamaica, after receiving, I quote, "a newspaper from England, which gives an account of the Spencer doctrine, muttered, there will be more white blood split in Jamaica than was in San Domingo." In her letter, Miss Campbell also mentioned an exceptional meeting of the House of Assembly of the island following her act of emancipation, when the representatives resolved not only to, I quote, "suspend all laws, imprison the Spencers as madmen, and let the proprietors of the country arm themselves, but also, and more urgently, to put both Miss Campbell and her slaves under strict surveillance in order to, I quote, eradicate the Spencers' delusion from their minds and the false notion that freedom is better than slavery." So this correspondence is probably, Wedderburn invented correspondence and forged letters. So it probably made up these letters too. In any case, the address of the Society of Spence and Philanthropists of 1817 was indeed reprinted in an 1817 supplement of the Jamaican Royal Gazette, which was probably the newspaper from England to which Miss Campbell referred in her probably invented forged letter. The reprint included editorial comment defining Spencer's thought as a set of dangerous and leveling doctrines and giving an idea of the striking diffusion of Spenceanism. I quote from the supplement that you see in the slide. So this document is as extraordinary an instance of the perversion of the first principles and the delusion of the human mind. Its consequences, however fatal, are concealed under insinuating arguments and captivating language, and the equal partition of property which it recommends is not the less dangerous because its supporters belong to the lower classes of the community. There is not a town in the kingdom in which the Spences Society has not its agents, its emissaries, its sections and committees. Even more remarkably, Spence's plan was also implicated in Busa's rebellion of April 1816, the largest slave revolt in the history of Barbados. So you see here an extract from the report from the Select Committee of the House of Assembly of the island, which had been appointed in 1816 to inquire into the causes of the rebellion, and informed that the report of the Barbadian House of Assembly informs that the colonists deprecate the introduction of that inconsistent spirit of canting philanthropy, which in Europe is only excited by the injuries or the miseries of the poor and the profligate, and on the other side of the Atlantic is never warm but towards the Sabbath, the mulatto, and the slave. More particularly do they deprecate the propagation of those doctrines whose object, alike in Great Britain and in the colonies, is to erect a baseless and visionary fabric of liberty upon the ruins of the privileged class, whether promulgated under the authority of the Spencean or the African philanthropists. So the African philanthropists were maybe the British abolitionists, as they were called in this way. So this report mirrored a quite common opinion among the slave owners across Barbados, namely that the Busa's rebellion had been inflamed by the spies and informers sent to Barbados by the abolitionist member of parliament, William Wilberforce, the famous anti-slavery campaigner. But the document also suggested that, together with the liberal and middle-class abolitionism of Wilberforce and his fellow African philanthropists, the other British abolitionists, a popular and much more radical anti-slavery discourse had probably fueled the rebellion, Spenceanism. The Barbadian House of Assembly's report, I think, provides reliable evidence of an African-Caribbean propagation of Spence's plan, and shows how alarming the Spencean plan could sound in plantation societies. If the slave-owning members of the Barbadian House of Assembly were aware of the plan of Thomas Spence, it is possible that the enslaved knew it as well, thanks to the transatlantic circulation of periodicals. The report, and not just this report, but other documents related to the Busa's rebellion, repeatedly stressed that the slaves had been deluded by the information the literate among them were able to read in the British newspapers sold in Bridgetown. So one way or the other, the plan of Thomas Spence, who might have visited Scotland but spent his entire life in England, managed to land in the West Indies a few years after his death, and it may well have inspired the largest slave revolt in the history of Barbados. It is possible, in fact, that it was precisely Spence's concern with the land, which seemed to many the anachronistic feature of his thought in Britain, that rendered him and his plan relevant from an Atlantic and colonial perspective, especially in the West Indies, where the relationship between land and freedom, which corresponded to the negative one between plantation and slavery, was an everyday truth to the enslaved. So I think that now should come to the conclusion. So the purpose of this presentation today was to briefly show that Spence was the original thinker, and that the influence of his political plan extended far and wide within and beyond Britain between the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. As he advocated the abolition of private land ownership, the redistribution of wealth through the system of so-called dividends, and the decolonization of European empires, all to be accomplished by means of a violent revolution, the name of Thomas Spence became well known to the state, but also to colonial authorities in those years. And his plan was widely understood as a dangerously subversive doctrine, and costed its author and also his followers several encounters with the law and state repression. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to knowing your comments. And I think I will. Okay.
Thank you so much for that deeply fascinating talk, both again on the all of the details of the different components of the plan Spence laid out, which is so, I'm sure for anyone not without familiarity with them already, sort of stunning in terms of how much they resemble things that otherwise we would think of as ideas that come along much later. And for that, the really fascinating link to kind of cross-Atlantic links to revolution and unrest and unease among the planters in the Caribbean. So I will remind everyone in the audience, if you would like to pose a question, send me a message in the chat. You can either send me your question, I will read it out, or if you would like to, be unmuted so you can pose it directly yourself, just let me know that as well. But first, I will take the traditional chair's privilege of posing, I guess, I think it's sort of two interrelated questions myself. So the first one is sort of how, in the circles in which he was operating in the 1790s onwards. What was Spence's relationship with other, I guess, other members of the corresponding clubs and so on in Britain? To what extent did he, you know, how much, I guess, ideological diversity was there among that set of people? Was he sort of on the same page as most of them, you know, and then as the sort of Spenceans formed as a group, were they, you know, to what extent were they aligned with other sort of more radical social forces? To what extent were they isolated? That kind of question. And then the second question that I think I should link to that because it's closely related in a way is also, you know, I think you really brought out how many just the volume of sort of original ideas for social reordering that Thomas Spence had, many of which, of course, we can see sort of, you know, today, different derivations from them. But I'm wondering, was it, you know, in your research, is it he's just coming up with all of these on his own, sort of through his own internal reflection, or was he drawing upon particular resources, you know, other thinkers as well, in developing some of those ideas?
Oh, thank you very much for your very interesting questions. So I hope I am able to address them. As to the first one, so the relation of the Spence's relation with other members of the London Corresponding Society and in general is contemporaries. He probably joined the London Corresponding Society from the very beginning, we know that the London Corresponding Society was divided into sections, and one of Spence's biographers, Mary Kemp Ashraf, wrote that Spence joined the Violent Democrats of the 12th Division of the London Corresponding Society. The London Corresponding Society was mainly a philo-republican association, and they also they deserved the name of English Jacobins because of their support for the ideas coming from across the Channel. At the same time, they were also, I think it was December 1793, or maybe, early the following year, the society also issued a resolution against what they call leveling principles, which was the very broad name with which they refer to any kind of proposal for the abolition or leveling of private property. And they also declared that private property was that couldn't be violated. From this perspective, of course, Spence's vision was deeply more radical. He remained connected with the society at least, I think, until 1794-95, because he also reprinted some of the reports of the society. But at some point, it became extremely critical of his fellow associates, and he most probably left the society. Especially after 1794, when he was arrested with other fellow associates, but while the others had been released, after shortly released, he was imprisoned without trial. In general, another very famous connection that I could mention is that with Thomas Paine. Spence had a most tormented intellectual relation with Thomas Paine throughout his life. First of all, Spence claimed to be the first one to use the phrase rights of man. I don't know if we can trust him, but he claimed to be the first one. And in general, he considered Paine. So Paine was extremely famous in Britain, and not just in Britain, within and beyond Britain in those years. So it was kind of an inevitable point of reference. And his writings were extremely popular as well. However, Spence was especially when Paine published Agrarian Justice in 1797, the writing in which Paine addressed the issue of land reform, and also proposed a system of kind of redistribution of wealth, which was much less radical than Spence's dividends, without even mentioning Spence. Spence started being extremely critical towards his much more famous contemporary. This also leads me to answer your second question. So yeah, Spence was not really an isolated thinker, and I think he drew a lot from thinkers of the like previous thinkers as well. So he drew a lot also from John Locke, for instance. So apparently, even if he was a self-educated radical and he was really poor harassed and persecuted throughout his life, apparently he did know also the tradition much better than I think has previously been thought, as his collection of extracts, Pig's Meat or Lessons to the Swinish Multitude demonstrates. So that collection of extracts is full of passages from very famous classic texts of British, and not just British, European political thoughts between the 17th and the 18th centuries, from John Locke to Rousseau to James Harrington, for example. However, I think that he was able indeed to sketch a plan which was in itself quite original, because he, in a way, pushed other thinkers' solutions to kind of extreme conclusions. One of the major sources of inspiration for Spence's for the development of Spence's thought was the French Revolution, and especially the Jacobins. So he was thrilled when he knew what was happening across the Channel, while most of his contemporaries in Britain were extremely worried about the violent turn of the French Revolution. However, again, after a couple of years of excitement about the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution, Spence then became also very critical about French revolutionary developments. And it is also interesting that he basically was also one of the first, as far as I know, to in a way contribute his views to the debate around the interpretation of the French Revolution. I'm thinking about the Marxist interpretation of the revolution as the bourgeois revolution, and the so-called revisionist interpretation of the revolution as a political and not an ideological and not a social phenomenon. And Spence, before this debate, was already reflecting about the meaning of the revolution, and at the end, he understood the Jacobins as extremely interested in preserving the private land ownership, as they in fact were, and as interested in let's say conquering the state apparatus without accomplishing a social revolution. I don't know if I did answer, but I just wanted to say that he was, of course, not isolated, but he drew a lot, he recovered a lot from the thinkers, from his contemporaries and the thinkers of the previous generations. But at the same time, he was substantially more, much more extreme in his views.
No, absolutely. You answered the question, and really interesting to hear about, yeah, both the sort of Thomas Paine connection, or sort of developing antipathy, and the relationship to some of the other developments. Actually, maybe to connected to that as well. I know you mentioned sort of at one point later in your talk his criticism of a speech by George Washington, I think it was, concerning, the particular Native American community who didn't want to sell their land to the United States. I guess so. I guess there my question as well is you mentioned sort of his enthusiasm for the French Revolution, and then his growing concern that it wasn't following through on its more radical potentials. I wonder what his impressions were of the earlier American revolution, in terms, I mean, of course, in terms of to what extent he saw some radical ideas potentially embedded within it, to what extent he saw all of the, non-radical things happening. And also maybe, and in that connection, it's sort of, I think one of the really fascinating things you bring out are the transatlantic connections between thinkers in the Caribbean and so on, and potential rebellions there of enslaved people. I don't know how, to what extent in the post sort of American Revolutionary world exactly what the networks were in relationship to North America, but just kind of how he understood developments in, I guess, the United States in particular, in the period he was working.
Oh, thank you very much. So yeah, so Spence didn't actually talk much about the American Revolution, I must say. So there are some implicit yet very clear references, such as the name of these parishes of Spensonia would be the United Parishes of Spensonia. So I mean, these of course resonated what was happening overseas. But apart from when the American Revolution was happening, he was still in Newcastle and mainly concerned about the land. I think that when he moved to London and he encountered organized abolitionism in the capital, so I suppose that he did not come across abolitionist ideas while he was still in Newcastle, even if Newcastle was an extremely lively place with an extremely lively print culture. But I guess that it was in London. Spence. So in 1792, for instance, there was the big sugar boycott in London, and the working class in the capital participated massively in the sugar boycotts in solidarity with the enslaved overseas. And I'm sure that, maybe his abolitionist ideas should be dated later. So yes, I mean, on the American Revolution itself, it didn't say much at all. It is very interesting, though, yes, that he addressed and commented on George Washington's State of the Union address, again in relation to the problem of privatization of land, which, of course, I mean, as the 1796 pamphlet of Spence, The Reign of Felicity, demonstrates, was extremely connected to the problem of colonization and dispossession of indigenous peoples. However, yes, his abolitionist ideas were, I think, more related to the development of the abolitionist movement in the capital in the early 1790s, and as such, they were connected to the British West Indies instead with the United States. And it's also interesting, something that I didn't mention. So I have analyzed other Caribbean newspapers in the years that followed the execution of the leaders of the Cato Street conspiracy, and in the years that immediately preceded the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. And it is, and I found several references about which I included in the book about, yeah, you might know that the British working class then became increasingly racist in the years of the abolition of slavery. Because at some point, as it is happening today, I mean, I'm Italian, so it's happening today, for, at least in my country, in the debate around migrations, the support for the enslaved overseas was equated with neglect for the poor at home. And this also affected the British, I mean, this was a conservative discourse, of course, which also affected the British working classes. With the act of the abolition of slavery in 1833, the compensation of £20 million was allocated to be given to not to the enslaved for centuries of slavery, but to these plantation owners who had been divested of their what they consider their private property, and that the £20 million compensation was taken from tax revenue. So that the discourse was the British working class should not pay for the emancipation of those of other slaves, which are slaves as much as themselves. But apparently, Spenceanism didn't, or what remained of Spenceanism didn't participate in this increasing racialization of the British working class movement, because in Caribbean newspapers, when talking about the abolition of slavery, several advocates for the emancipation of the slaves and the abolition of slavery, guaranteed. I'm not thinking about an immediate and complete abolition of slavery. I'm not a disciple of Spence. I'm not a Spencean, and this is quite. And I found, several mentions of that in the years immediately preceding emancipation. So apparently, Spenceanism didn't participate in this increasing racialization of the working class ideology. Yeah, sorry, I just maybe talk about something completely different from
No, not at all. I mean, really fascinating connections there, and walking us sort of forwards a few decades as well. Just, I mean, all really fascinating stuff. So thanks everyone. Thanks most of all to Dr. Cazzola for her brilliant talk and for, joining us here in Hong Kong to teach us about her book. And I look forward to seeing you all at further seminars in future. So take care, everyone. Have a great day.